Well, let's start with what Biden was doing. He was basically saying that Venezuela, the state, owes a lot of entities in the United States, not just in the petroleum sector, a lot of entities, a lot of money. So we will loosen the sanctions a little bit so that the crude that you produce can be sold and you never see that money.
Okay.
That money goes to the American firms that you owe money to. And if you can keep this up and not be a jerk about it, then a year from now, when you've paid off those debts, we will then begin a more serious conversation about the broader environment. Do I think that Maduro is a great governor? No. Do I think he's the kind of person that should be allowed to be in control of Venezuela for the long run? Not really. I would argue that maybe we're not the people to make that decision. That should be the Venezuelans. Mm-hmm. But we're setting the stage for theoretically what comes next. And if Maduro decides to go back to his old habits, then this dissolves in a day and it's no harm to us. Or, I mean, if it stops tomorrow, we're not in any worse place than we were the day before.
I suppose that's true, yeah.
If your goal is to actually get Venezuela back to its peak of producing 3 to 5 million barrels a day, that's a different conversation. Because we have had full-on state collapse complete with famine across the Venezuelan space. And this isn't Saudi Arabia where it's an easy field close to the coast. You've got a line of coastal mountains, then you've got your population belt, and your oil's below that. So if you want to resurrect Venezuela, you need to send in at least 50,000 troops and physically rebuild the country from the ground up over the course of a decade. And then you have the option of spending $200 to $300 billion to resurrect the world's most complicated oil production system. And if you start today, you will not get your first oil most likely until at least 2035. Well, it's not something we are interested in.
Yeah.
But if you fast forward a year or two, and the Middle East is being the Middle East again, and the Russian oil is gone, and the Americans have basically built a little wall around their own energy markets, then you're going to have global energy prices that on a cheap day are looking like 150 and are typically over $200
per barrel.
Yeah.
Wow.
And in that sort of environment, the Europeans are like, hey, Washington, would you mind if we colonized Venezuela? What sort of deal can we strike that you'll just let that happen? That's the scale of what has to happen here. And keep in mind that this is not the 1800s when the Europeans had the gun and everyone else had spears.
Yeah.
Hugo Chavez, one of his last big acts before he died, is he distributed 150,000 AK-47s to the population. So anyone who thinks that this is going to be easy is wrong in every possible way. Libya has a similar situation. The population's on the coast, the infrastructure runs through the populated areas, but the oil's deep in the desert. Now, because it's not tropics, because there aren't a lot of mountains, because the population is so much smaller, it would be easier. But the only country that I think is likely to consider that would be Italy. And I don't know how well you know your colonial history, but every time that Italy has tried to have a colony in the last 300 years, it's been a shit show. Crazy, because the northern third of Italy, where half the population lives, that's more technologically advanced than Japan. In output per hour worked, it's more productive than northern Germany. The southern half is a bit of a crazy. But in order to make that northern third work, they have to have access to gobs of energy. So they actually have a pretty sophisticated energy system. They can take any flavor of crude and mix it to make something that any of the refineries can run. One of the few places in the world that can do that. But they have to still be able to source the crude. And in a post-American deglobalized world, that becomes a big problem. Libya is right next door. Well, the idea is really sexy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you can get enough copper and zinc and everything else, then you can basically declare independence from petroleum. And that sounds great, but making electricity is a lot more sophisticated than an internal combustion engine. I mean, internal combustion engine, I'm oversimplifying here. You light a match, you burn something, you capture the heat, you go. That's what it is, basically. If you want an electricity storage system and transmission system, you need an order of magnitude more machinery, more materials, and more different kinds of materials. You need your cobalt, you need your lithium, your copper, your zinc, and all the rest. And that means that you may, if you're successful, be able to declare independence from a world dominated by Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, and Russia. But it now means that you have to be inextricably linked to Canada and Mexico and Bolivia and Chile and Brazil and Argentina and Peru and Vietnam and Indonesia and Malaysia and Australia and Pakistan and India and China and Kazakhstan and Mongolia and Turkey and Algeria and, oh yeah, still Russia.
Because of rare earth metals and stuff like that? Is that why we're...
Well, that's not... I mean, rare earths is like one of the few things that we actually have covered. You need at least 5 times as much of all of these materials as the global production right now to make the green transition work. It's a lot of copper. And we just don't have production capacity necessary to support this on a global scale. And we're losing the Russian stuff. And very soon we're going to lose the Chinese processing capability. So if you're going to apply these technologies, you are only going to apply them in places where they really work well. So a good solar belt, a good wind belt. So that's the American Great Plains, that's the American Southwest, and that's great. Australia looks fantastic, but there are not a lot of places where people live that are in sunny or windy locations. Assuming there's no permitting problem, 1,000 miles is roughly the maximum distance that you can ship power. Nuclear's great. There's just three problems. Number one is disposal of the spent fuel. That's actually the easiest problem.
Yeah, seems solvable.
Yeah, nobody wants a nuclear repository in their backyard. I get it. Problem number two is time. Assuming there were no regulations, assuming that you could just build it whatever you wanted, wherever you wanted, it's about 7 years from the point that you put your first money in till you get your first electricity.
Wow.
You know, that's a pretty long delta.
Yeah.
And then third is uranium. The world's largest source of uranium is Kazakhstan.
Okay.
And Russia's number 4.
We're still tied to Russia.
And most of what is produced in Kazakhstan is processed in Russia into fuel rods. So you can't do this without the Russians at scale. I'd argue that rare earths really aren't an issue.
Okay.
Rare earth production is a byproduct of almost every kind of mining. It's a processing issue. And most of that is done in China because it's dirty. It's not that it's expensive. It's just the Chinese have subsidized it so people can get the finished product for a low cost.
Got it.
And it's like, why would you process it yourself if you can get it from the Chinese at a third of what it would cost you to do it yourself? So you're like, go do it. But 10 years ago, when they tried to blackmail the Japanese with rare earths access, everyone went out and built out the processing capacity because the technology is 1920s technology. It's not hard. It's not even expensive. And most of that's been done. So if China were to fall in on itself tomorrow, we'd probably have about 6 months that it would take to spin all this infrastructure up, but it's already been paid for. So we'd be okay with rare earths. The problem is copper and lithium and getting it in volume. Most of the world's lithium comes from Chile and Australia, and they're continuing to produce more and more and more. Copper is primarily Chile again, and Russia and Indonesia. So the Russian stuff is going away. We don't have enough of either of those to maintain a moderate green build-out in the United States, much less global at scale. Now, in a post-globalized system where Chile and Australia are part of the American network, that gives us some opportunities that other countries don't have. You take their production, you concentrate it into the Western Hemisphere for sales. That just might work in places where this makes sense. But everywhere else, there's just not enough. The industrial build-out in Mexico is epic. And the Mexicans, on average, are more skilled than Chinese laborers, and they're 1/3 the cost. There are very, very few economic manufacturing sectors where the Mexicans are not already the low-cost, high-quality producer compared to China. And so that is proceeding apace. Problems. Number one, there's only 130 million Mexicans. They've got 1/10 the population of China, so they can't do it all. So it has to be a group effort with the United States and Vietnam and others involved. So we have to basically relocate a whole lot of industrial plant. You don't do that overnight, no matter how disparate your situation is.
Right.
Second, electronics. What makes East Asia dominant in electronics is they've got a labor system that taps 12 different labor markets with different skill sets, all in close proximity. So you do the injection molding in one place, the die cast in another, you make the wires in one place, the wiring harness in another, you process the copper in one place, you make the semiconductor in another, and it's doing all of these things differently, efficiently, and then bringing them together for assembly at yet another place. In North America, we have 2 labor markets. We've got the US and Canada, which are broadly the same, high tech, and then we've got Mexico, which does middle manufacturing very well. It's the delta between them that gives you good economies of scale and network effects for electronics manufacturing because there's so many steps. Well, only in the US-Mexico border region do we get that interface. So we don't have the 12-step labor market that the Asians have, which means we're going to have to retool everything that we bring back in the electronics space in order to do it at scale. And that's going to look very different, and we are going to have to make that up as we go. And that will probably be the economic sector where we feel the most pain from the change.